The sound was a violation, a sharp crack that tore through the velvet silence of the Sovereign Club. Eleanor's hand stung, the imprint of a man's jawbone blooming against her palm. For a frozen second, the room held its breath. The clinking of crystal, the murmur of billion-dollar deals all ceased. Mr. Allister's face, a mask of pleasant condescension moments before, twisted into a canvas of pure fury. His fingers, thick with gold rings, clamped around her arm like a vice, digging into the bone. A gasp escaped someone at a nearby table. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot up her arm, but it was the humiliation that truly burned. From the darkest corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the leather booth, a figure rising with an unnerving, deliberate calm. But what happened in that suffocating silence would change more than just her evening. It would redefine her entire existence. And if you watch until the end, you will understand how a single act of defiance can attract the most dangerous kind of attention. Subscribe now to follow her journey and tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place. Her name was Eleanor Vance, 28, and she was a ghost in a bespoke world. As a hostess, her job was to be an elegant, smiling apparition, guiding the city's most powerful men to their tables without ever truly being seen. She wore her dignity like a shield, a quiet armor forged in a life that had taught her resilience was a silent, solitary battle. Each night she navigated this gilded cage with a practiced grace, her expression a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. Inside, however, a quiet storm of exhaustion and resolve churned. This job wasn't a career, it was a penance, a means to pay for a past that clung to her like the expensive perfume in the air. The atmosphere of the Sovereign Club was a sensory prison. The low, golden light seemed to absorb sound, creating a conspiratorial hum. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather, rich cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of ambition. Her world was a series of repeating sounds: the soft thud of the heavy velvet curtain at the entrance, the discreet whisper of a sommelier, the distant, rhythmic percussion of the chef's knife from the kitchen. Her own reflection, a fleeting, weary stranger in polished silver and dark wood, was a constant reminder of her place. She was an ornament, functional and forgettable, in a world where she owned nothing, not even the air she breathed. She carried the weight of a promise made at a hospital bedside, a vow to protect the only family she had left. Her younger brother's future was a debt she paid in nightly increments of feigned smiles and swallowed insults. This secret burden was the source of her unyielding moral compass. It was why she endured the leering glances and the casual cruelty of men like Alistair. Her integrity was not for her own sake, but for his. It made her both incredibly vulnerable to the pressures of her world and paradoxically unbreakable. She could bend under the weight of it all, but she had sworn to herself and to a memory that she would never, ever break. Away from the club, her life was a study in contrasts. Her small apartment was a sanctuary of Spartan cleanliness and quiet order, the antithesis of the opulent chaos she managed each night. The only color came from the spines of second-hand books stacked neatly on a single shelf, stories of worlds far removed from her own. Here, in the stillness, her solitude was a tangible presence, a constant, silent companion. She would often stand by the window, watching the relentless pulse of Manhattan below, feeling utterly disconnected from the rhythm of the city. She was a spectator to life, trapped behind the glass of her own circumstances, waiting for a story of her own to begin. Tonight, something had felt different long before Alistair had cornered her. It was the man in the corner booth, Julian Thorne. He was a permanent fixture in the club's darkest, most coveted alcove, a predator at rest. He never demanded, never raised his voice, and never drew attention. Yet the entire room orbited his stillness. He simply watched, his gaze sweeping over the clientele with an unnerving, analytical weight. Earlier, his eyes had found hers, and for a moment she felt not like an object, but a puzzle he was carefully dismantling. It was not a look of desire, but of recognition, a chilling, silent acknowledgement that saw past the polite hostess and into the fractured woman beneath. The journey home was a descent. Eleanor would shed the skin of the Sovereign Club the moment she stepped onto the grimy, fluorescent-lit bus. The press of damp coats and weary bodies was a brutal contrast to the perfumed air and personal space she policed all night. Here she was just another tired face reflected in the rain-streaked window, her severe hostess uniform hidden beneath a practical threadbare coat. The city blurred past, a smear of neon and concrete that seemed to mock the gilded cage she had just escaped. This daily transition was a reminder of the chasm between worlds, the one she served and the one she inhabited. She was a citizen of the space in between, belonging to neither, her existence defined by the journey from one form of servitude to another. Her apartment was a testament to quiet control, a small, clean box high above the city's ceaseless noise. It was her sanctuary, the only place where she could exhale. The furniture was sparse, chosen for function over form, but everything had its place. On a small nightstand, a single framed photograph was the room's only personal touch. A smiling boy with her eyes, his face frozen in a moment before life had become complicated. This was Leo, her brother, the anchor and the chain of her existence. The silence in the apartment was profound, a heavy blanket she wrapped around herself each night, a stark counterpoint to the forced pleasantries and veiled threats that paid for this solitary peace and his distant, fragile future. The promise she carried was a physical weight in her chest, a vow whispered in the sterile quiet of a hospital room years ago. Leo's talent was a brilliant, fragile thing that needed nurturing, protection, and above all, money. The tuition for his art academy was a mountain she chipped away at with every demeaning smile and every swallowed insult. Her sacrifice was a secret language between them, an unspoken pact that fueled her endurance. She was not just surviving for herself, she was the guardian of his dream, the silent benefactor of a life she hoped would be everything hers was not. This responsibility was the source of her unyielding code. It was why she could not afford a single misstep, a single crack in her composure. Her direct superior at the club, a man named Dubois, wielded his authority with the precision of a surgeon. He never raised his voice, but his disapproval was a chilling presence. He would inspect her appearance with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on a loose strand of hair or an imagined scuff on her shoe. "Remember your place, Eleanor," he'd murmur, his voice a silken threat. "There are 100 girls who would kill for this opportunity." He was a gatekeeper to her survival, a constant reminder that her dignity was a luxury, not a right. His quiet tyranny was part of the club's architecture, as integral as the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, designed to keep the staff polished, silent, and perpetually on edge. The uniform was her armor and her cage, a dress of severe black silk that was tailored to be elegant yet unobtrusive, designed to erase her individuality. Each evening, the ritual of dressing for work was a slow erasure of self. She would pull her hair back into a tight, merciless chignon, her reflection becoming sharper, colder.
The woman in the mirror was not Eleanor Vance, the sister who loved old books and quiet mornings. She was the hostess, a functional object of grace and efficiency. The uniform was a constant physical reminder of her role: to be seen but not known, to facilitate the desires of others while suppressing all of her own. It was a costume for a part she played with exhausting perfection. She remembered a night months earlier when a senator, drunk on power and expensive scotch, had mistaken her for a personal servant, demanding she retrieved his coat from a private room. When she politely redirected him to the cloakroom attendant, his face had darkened. He had complained to Dubois, and she had been forced to offer a formal, humiliating apology for insubordination. The memory was a small, sharp stone she carried with her. It was a lesson in the club's unspoken rules. The powerful were always right, and her sense of propriety was irrelevant. These small surrenders chipped away at her spirit, each one a silent crack in the foundation of her resolve, building a pressure that had to, eventually, find a release. The financial strain was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of her calm exterior. Piles of envelopes on her small kitchen counter were not letters from friends, but demands: rent, utilities, and the ever-present, crippling tuition statements for Leo. She would trace the bold red numbers with her finger, the figure seeming to mock her nightly efforts. Each dollar earned at the club was already spent, a ghost of a currency that passed through her hands but never truly belonged to her. This relentless pressure was a vice, squeezing her choices until there was only one path: endure. It made her job both a lifeline and a slow poison, a place she dreaded yet desperately needed equal measure. In the quietest hours, just before dawn, she would allow herself to dream. She would pull a worn book of poetry from her shelf and use herself in worlds built of words, worlds where women had voices and choices. She had once wanted to be a writer, to craft stories that gave meaning to the silent struggles she witnessed every day. But that dream felt like it belonged to another person, another life. It was a fragile, beautiful thing she kept locked away, too precious to expose to the harsh reality of her circumstances. This hidden inner world was her most valuable secret, a wellspring of empathy and strength that the patrons of the Sovereign Club could never touch and would never understand. Tonight, the air in the club felt different, charged with a predatory stillness. It was the way Mr. Alastair watched her, his eyes following her every move with a possessive, proprietary gaze. He was a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he wanted, and his polite inquiries had always felt like assessments, his compliments like warnings. She could feel the storm gathering around him, a shift in the atmosphere that put every nerve on high alert.
Her training screamed at her to be invisible, to deflect and disappear. But a deeper, more primal instinct was stirring. A weariness so profound it was beginning to feel dangerously like courage. The carefully constructed dam of her composure was beginning to fracture under the relentless pressure. He cornered her by the arched doorway leading to the kitchens, the sounds of clattering pans and sharp orders a stark backdrop to his low, cultured voice. He blocked her path, not with force, but with the sheer weight of his presence. "Eleanor," he said, his smile a predatory curve, "a woman of your quiet dignity shouldn't have to work so hard." His words were a violation, a quiet insinuation that stripped away her professionalism and reduced her to an object for purchase. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm, and in that single, entitled touch, every swallowed insult, every silent humiliation, and every ounce of her suppressed rage coalesced into a single blinding point of clarity. The shadow that detached itself from the leather booth moved with a liquid grace that defied its size. It was not a hurried or aggressive movement, but the inexorable advance of a tide. The man, Julian Thorne, was a name whispered in the club but never spoken aloud, a myth given form in tailored charcoal wool. As he crossed the marble floor, the ambient hum of the room did not just quiet, it was extinguished, sucked into the vacuum of his presence. His steps were silent, measured, each one a deliberate beat in a new, terrifying rhythm that had just seized control of the room. He didn't look at Alistair, whose face was a mask of indignant rage, nor did he scan the stunned faces of the clientele. His entire world, it seemed, had narrowed to the small, brutal tableau of a man's thick fingers clamped around a woman's slender arm. He was a study in controlled force, a masterpiece of dark elegance. His suit was so dark it seemed to absorb the low, golden light of the room, and the stark white of his shirt was a slash of purity against the shadow. His face was all sharp angles and disciplined planes, a face that gave nothing away and yet promised a history of violence and absolute authority. There was no visible security, no entourage of brutish men to announce his power. He was his own fortress, his stillness a more potent threat than any bodyguard could be. Around him, the air itself seemed to defer, to grow colder and denser. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, and he had just stepped into the light, not for conquest, but for a reason no one could yet comprehend. As he drew closer, his gaze remained fixed, not on Eleanor's face, but on the point of contact, the violation. He saw the white of Alistair's knuckles, the angry red marks blooming on her skin, the slight involuntary tremor in her hand. It was an appraisal, cold and clinical, yet in the depths of his dark eyes, something shifted. He looked up, finally meeting her gaze, and what he saw there stopped him for a fraction of a second. It wasn't just fear or defiance. It was a bedrock of integrity, a quiet, unyielding resolution that reminded him of a part of himself he had long ago buried beneath layers of necessity and sin. He saw a principle, pure and unbroken, and it resonated with a chord deep inside him he thought had gone silent forever. That look was the first true contact, a silent collision of two worlds. His eyes were not cruel, but they were heavy with the weight of things seen and done, carrying an ancient wariness that seemed at odds with his controlled power. For Eleanor, it was like being seen for the first time, stripped bare of her uniform and her carefully constructed composure. He saw the exhaustion, the fear, but also the steel spine holding her upright. She felt an involuntary shiver, a sensation that was equal parts terror and a strange, unnerving fascination. It was the feeling of being recognized by a predator, not as prey, but as something rare and inexplicable, something that did not fit into the established order of his world. Without a word, Julian Thorne reached out. His hand was large, the fingers long and elegant, but it moved with an unnerving calm. He did not strike Alistair or shove him away. Instead, he simply laid his hand over Alistair's, covering the thick fingers that were still digging into Eleanor's arm. There was no overt pressure, no show of brute strength, but the effect was immediate and absolute. Alistair's grip went slack, as if every ounce of power had been siphoned from his body. The transfer of dominance was silent, swift, and total. Julian's touch was cool and firm, a shield of quiet authority that settled over the point of pain. And in that moment, he was not just stopping an assault, he was claiming the space around her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Alistair, his face now pale with a mixture of confusion and dawning fear, looked from Julian's impassive face to the hand covering his own. He was a man used to wielding power, but he was now in the presence of its source. Julian's gaze finally shifted, moving from Eleanor to Alistair for the first time. The look held no anger, no emotion at all, which was far more terrifying. It was the look of a man observing an insect. Then his voice, a low and resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the room, uttered a single quiet word that was not a request, but a verdict. Leave.
The command was absolute, leaving no room
for argument or appeal. Alistair flinched as if struck. The word hung in the air, an irrevocable judgment. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling slightly as he retreated. He offered no apology, no explanation. He simply turned and fled, his panicked exit a clumsy, pathetic spectacle that only served to amplify the sheer, effortless power of the man who remained. The entire room watched him go, a collective held breath released only when the heavy velvet curtains swung shut behind him. The threat had been neutralized, the order of the universe restored, but it was a new order, one dictated by the silent man who now stood before Eleanor, the quiet center of the storm he had just quelled with a single word. The room remained a frozen tableau, the patrons and staff afraid to move, to speak, to even breathe. Julian's attention returned to Eleanor. He glanced down at her arm, where the ghost of Alistair's grip remained in a pattern of angry red marks. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze softened for an imperceptible moment, a flicker of something that might have been empathy, or perhaps just a quiet acknowledgement of the wound. He didn't try to touch her again, or offer any empty platitudes of comfort. He simply stood there, giving her the space to reclaim her breath, his presence a silent, protective barrier between her and the rest of the world that had, moments before, been ready to watch her be devoured. He held her gaze for another long moment, the silence between them charged with unspoken meaning. She was still trembling, not from fear of Alistair anymore, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of this man's intervention. She felt a debt had just been created, one she could never possibly repay, and didn't understand. Finally, he spoke again, his voice just for her, the words precise and weighted. Courage like that, he said, his eyes holding hers, shouldn't go unprotected. It wasn't a threat, nor was it an offer. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a principle she had just embodied and that he, for reasons of his own, had chosen to honor. The words settled over her, a promise and a warning in one. With a final, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked back toward his corner of the room, his departure as silent and deliberate as his arrival. As he moved, the spell he had cast over the room began to break. The low murmur of conversation slowly returned, glasses clinked, but the atmosphere was forever changed. Everyone in that room now knew who held the real power. And they knew that, for some unknown reason, the quiet hostess was now under the purview of that power. Eleanor remained rooted to the spot, her arm tingling, not from pain, but from the memory of his quiet, decisive intervention. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was left standing in the terrifying, uncertain epicenter of the shift. The days that followed were a study in controlled tension. Eleanor moved through her shifts at the Sovereign Club with a heightened awareness, every nerve ending alive to the subtle currents of the room. She felt Julian Thorne's presence even when she could not see him, a weight in the atmosphere, a shift in the quality of the silence. He was there, in his usual corner, a figure etched into the penumbra, watching. His gaze was no longer just analytical, it was proprietary, a silent claim that both terrified and anchored her. She tried to ignore it, to submerge herself in the familiar rhythms of her work, but it was like trying to ignore the tide. His silent observation had become a part of the club's architecture, as permanent and imposing as the marble columns that held up the ceiling. Her colleagues treated her with a new cautious respect, mixed with a palpable fear.
Whispers followed her down the polished corridors, speculative and hushed. They saw her not as Eleanor Vance anymore, but as a woman marked by the city's most enigmatic power. Dubois, her manager, became a model of strained politeness, his usual veiled criticisms replaced by a wide, deferential berth. This new status was a cage of a different kind, isolating her in a bubble of fearful reverence. She had not asked for this protection, and its invisible walls were beginning to feel as oppressive as the threats they were meant to ward off. She was an object of speculation, a puzzle no one dared to solve, and the solitude she had once known now felt like a profound and dangerous isolation. Their first encounter after that night was a collision of silences. She was leaving late, the city's chill biting through her thin coat, when a black car, sleek and silent as a panther, pulled up to the curb beside her. The back window slid down, revealing his profile against the city lights. He didn't speak, merely looked at her, an unspoken question in his eyes. It was not an invitation, but an assessment of her safety. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Fear told her to run, to disappear into the anonymity of the subway. But a deeper, more stubborn instinct held her rooted to the spot. She met his gaze, gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, and continued walking, feeling his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. He began to appear in the peripheral of her life. She saw him once across the street from the small cafe where she bought her morning coffee, standing perfectly still, a dark suit against the grimy brick, before melting into the crowd.
Another time, a rare first-edition book of poetry she had once mentioned admiring to a coworker appeared in a neatly wrapped package at her apartment door, with no card, no sender. These were not coincidences. They were messages. He was learning her world, her routines, the small, quiet things that made up her existence. Each gesture was a thread, weaving his dark, orderly universe into the fabric of her simple, moral one. She felt herself being mapped, understood, and the intimacy of it was more unnerving than any overt threat. She fought against the strange pull he exerted, the morbid fascination with the man behind the myth. The world she knew, the one built on clear lines of right and wrong, told her he was a monster, a creature of violence and shadow. Yet the man she had seen had acted with a quiet, decisive honor that shamed the so-called gentleman she served every night. She saw the deep control in his hands, the weary intelligence in his eyes, and a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. This contradiction was a constant, exhausting battle in her mind. She was afraid of what he represented, but she was becoming even more afraid of the part of her that was drawn to the humanity she glimpsed beneath the cold, impenetrable surface. For Julian, Eleanor was a disruption to a life built on absolute control. He found himself manufacturing reasons to be at the club, his vast empire momentarily neglected for the chance to observe her quiet, defiant grace. She was a relic from a world he no longer believed existed, a world where integrity was not a commodity to be bought or sold. Her simple act of defiance against Alistair had been a spark in the profound darkness of his reality, reminding him of a moral clarity he had sacrificed long ago at the altar of power and survival. He saw in her a strength that was pure, untainted by the compromises that had defined his own ascent, and it was a vision that both unsettled and compelled him in equal measure. He began to see his own reflection in her, or rather, the reflection of the man he might have been. Her quiet dignity, her fierce protection of her own moral code, it was a language he had once spoken fluently. Now it was a foreign tongue he was slowly, painfully remembering. He watched her navigate the predatory landscape of the club with an unwavering compass, and it exposed the rot at the core of his own world.
This woman, who had nothing, possessed a kind of wealth he could never acquire. Her spirit was a fortress he could not breach and did not want to. He was the king of a corrupt kingdom, and she was a citizen of a republic of one, governed by laws he had long forgotten. The tension between them became a physical presence whenever they were in the same room. It was in the way his gaze would find hers across the crowded space, a silent conversation passing between them that no one else could hear. It was in the careful way she would serve his table, her movements precise and professional, yet her hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she set down a glass. He never made it easy for her, his eyes following her every move, but he also never crossed a line. His presence was a constant test of her composure, a silent demand for acknowledgment that she refused to give, even as her heart raced with a mixture of fear and a strange burgeoning anticipation. One evening, as she was navigating a narrow passage between tables, a careless waiter jostled her, sending a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. Before she could react, Julian was there, his body shielding hers from the flying shards of crystal. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, a brief, firm touch that sent a jolt of heat through the fabric of her uniform. The contact was accidental, functional, lasting only a second, but it felt momentous. His proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, feel the solid warmth of his body. For that single, suspended moment, the noise of the club faded away, and there was only the frantic beating of her own heart and the steady, protective pressure of his hand. He helped her up, his expression unreadable, and then turned to the terrified waiter. His voice was dangerously soft. "Be more careful," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of an executioner's judgment. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten, but the effect was chilling. The young man could only nod, his face pale with terror. Julian's gaze then returned to Eleanor, searching her face for any sign of injury. His concern so stark and genuine it stole her breath. He was a creature of contradictions, a man who could command terror with a whisper and then turn to her with a look of unguarded solicitude. It was this duality that was slowly dismantling her defenses, piece by piece. She began to understand that his protection was not a gift, it was a brand. It marked her as his, not as property, but as a territory under his sovereignty. This realization was terrifying, yet it offered a strange, perilous comfort. In a world where she had always been vulnerable, always at the mercy of lesser men, his shadow was a shield. She hated herself for the security she felt in it, for the part of her that was beginning to rely on his silent, watchful presence. She was standing on the edge of a moral abyss, looking down, and the thing that was supposed to be the darkness was the only thing offering her a steady hand.
Her fear of him was slowly being eclipsed by a much more complex and dangerous emotion, a burgeoning, unwilling trust. He was fighting his own battle. The impulse to draw her into his world, to keep her close and safe, was at war with the certain knowledge that his world would destroy her. Her light was a beacon, but it was also fragile, and his life was a storm that extinguished all lights. To protect her, he had to keep his distance, yet every instinct screamed at him to pull her closer. This internal conflict made him colder, more remote in his dealings with others, but his focus on her only intensified. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with violence or money, but Eleanor was a problem of the soul, and for that he had no solution. He could only watch and wait and fight the unwinnable war within himself. The city itself seemed to conspire to bring them together. A sudden downpour forced her to take shelter under the awning of a closed art gallery one night, and his car materialized out of the rain-slicked darkness, pulling silently to the curb. He stepped out, holding a large black umbrella, and simply stood beside her, not speaking, sharing the small dry space. They watched the rain fall, two solitary figures in the sleeping city, the silence between them filled with everything they couldn't say. The air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and his quiet power. It was a moment of profound intimacy, more revealing than any conversation could have been, a shared stillness in the heart of the storm. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low murmur against the sound of the rain. "You should not be out this late alone." It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of his world, a world where the night held real, tangible dangers she couldn't imagine. It was a reminder of the chasm between them. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face softened by the dim light, and saw the immense burden he carried. "Some of us don't have a choice," she replied, her voice steady, though her insides were churning. Her words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of the very power that now shielded her. His jaw tightened, a flicker of something pained and ancient in his eyes. It was then that she noticed it, a small faded scar that traced the line of his left temple, partially hidden by his dark hair. It was an imperfection, a mark of vulnerability on a man who seemed flawless in his control. On impulse, she found herself wanting to reach out, to trace its path, to understand the story it told. The urge was so strong, so utterly reckless, that she had to clench her fists at her sides to stop herself. This was the true danger, she realized, not the violence he commanded, but the humanity he concealed. It was the part of him that bled, the part that could be wounded. That was the most potent threat to her resolve. The shift happened on a Tuesday. Dubois called her into his office, his face a mask of false regret. "Eleanor," he began, avoiding her eyes, "the board has received a significant complaint from Mr. Alastair's associates. They feel your continued presence creates an uncomfortable atmosphere." The words were a death sentence, delivered with bureaucratic cowardice. Her job, her brother's future, was being stripped away because she had refused to be a victim. Desperation, cold and sharp, pierced through her composure. She saw her carefully constructed world crumbling, the sacrifices of years turning to dust. She was being erased, punished for the very integrity that Julian had claimed to admire. Before she could even respond, the door to the office opened without a knock. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the small opulent room. He didn't look at Eleanor. His gaze was fixed on Dubois, a look of such cold, absolute authority that the manager seemed to shrink in his chair. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Julian said, his voice a silken blade. "Miss Vance is not an employee. She is my guest." The words were a declaration, an act of possession made public and undeniable. He stepped aside, holding the door open for her, his eyes finally meeting hers. They held a silent, urgent command, "Come with me." In that moment, she knew her old life was over, and the only path forward led directly into the heart of his darkness. She followed him without a word, a ghost in his wake. The walk from Dubois' office, through the main dining room, and out into the biting November air was the longest journey of her life. It was a silent parade, with Julian as the dark sovereign, and her as the spoils of a war she hadn't known was being fought. The faces of her former colleagues were a blur of shock and fear, the patrons a gallery of frozen curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her, branding her with a new identity she hadn't chosen. He never touched her, yet his proximity was a physical force, parting the crowd like a ship's prow through water. The heavy velvet curtain of the Sovereign Club swung shut behind them, not just closing a door, but sealing an entire chapter of her existence with a soft, final thud. The interior of his car was another world, a sealed chamber of profound silence and the scent of old leather and cold steel. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thunk, shutting out the city's noise completely.
Here, in this moving fortress, the tension she had held at bay crashed over her in a suffocating wave.
He drove with an economy of motion, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile a stoic silhouette against the smear of neon lights. He did not speak, did not look at her. The silence was no longer a space for observation, it was an interrogation chamber. Every tick of the unseen clock, every soft hum of the powerful engine seemed to amplify the question hanging between them. What now? She was no longer a hostess, no longer invisible. She was something else, a possession or a project, and the not knowing was a terror all its own. Her fear, a cold and familiar companion, began to curdle into something else, a sharp, searing anger. This man had intervened, yes, but he had also claimed her in front of the world she had so carefully navigated. He had stripped her of her quiet, hard-won agency and replaced it with his own overwhelming power. She was a pawn, moved from one square on the board to another, still subject to the whims of a king. The quiet dignity she had worn as armor was now just a costume in a play he was directing. A rebellion, fierce and primal, began to stir in the pit of her stomach. She had slapped one powerful man for crossing a line. This one had just redrawn her entire world without her permission. She would not, could not, remain silent. Why? The word was a tear in the fabric of the silence, small but sharp. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the frantic terror hammering against her ribs. It was not a plea, it was a demand. Julian's hands did not flinch on the wheel, but she saw a muscle feather in his jaw, the only sign he had heard her. She pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "You don't know me. Why would you do that? You've ruined my life to save my job, and now that job is gone anyway. What do you want from me?" It was the most reckless act of her life, a direct challenge to a man whose quietest whisper could level empires. She was breaking the cardinal rule of her survival: never, ever draw the attention of the predator. She was demanding he look at her not as a symbol, but as a person. He continued to drive for several long, agonizing seconds, the city lights painting fleeting patterns across his impassive face. She thought he would ignore her, or worse, answer with a threat that would put her back in her place. The power he held was absolute, and her questions were an insolence he had every right to crush. But when he finally spoke, his voice was not the cold, cutting instrument from the club. It was lower, rougher, weighted with a history she couldn't fathom. "Because I have seen that kind of courage before," he said, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. "In another life. It belonged to a girl who believed in right and wrong more than she believed in breathing. She reminded me that the world still had a moral center." His words hung in the charged air of the car, an unexpected confession that disarmed her anger. He spoke of his younger sister, of a time before the tailored suits and the empire of shadows. He painted a picture of a fierce, vibrant girl who fought for the powerless, who looked at the world's ugliness and refused to flinch. He spoke of her with a reverence that bordered on pain. "She saw a man beating his wife in the street," Julian continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "The kind of thing everyone sees and pretends they don't. But she didn't pretend. She stood between them. She had nothing but her own conviction, and for that she was broken. I was too young, too weak to stop it. I could only watch." The confession was a key, unlocking the frozen mystery of the man beside her. His entire life, the power, the control, the violence, it was all a fortress built around the memory of that failure. It was a vow made in blood and grief that he would never be powerless again. He was not a monster by choice, but a king by necessity, ruling over a brutal world to ensure that what happened to her would never happen again.
In protecting Eleanor, he hadn't been saving a stranger. He had been trying, across the chasm of years and sin, to save his sister's ghost. He was trying to rewrite the one failure that had defined him, the one sin for which his power offered no absolution. He was trying to redeem himself. In that moment, he was no longer Julian Thorne, the feared and untouchable myth. He was a man hollowed out by a grief so profound it had shaped his entire existence. The city lights slid over his face, and for a fleeting second she saw the boy he must have been, the one who had watched helplessly as his world broke apart. The fear she had felt for him evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it was a physical ache in her chest. Without thought, without calculation, she reached across the small space that separated their two worlds. She did not speak. She simply laid her hand on his, where it rested on the cool leather of the center console. The gesture was a silent acknowledgement, a bridge across the darkness. His reaction was instantaneous and violent. He flinched as if her touch were a live flame, snatching his hand back. His entire body went rigid, his control shattered. The car swerved slightly before he corrected it with a sharp, disciplined movement. It wasn't her he was recoiling from. It was the purity of the gesture, the simple human contact he had long ago deemed himself unworthy of. It was a reminder of a world of gentleness and forgiveness he had locked himself out of forever.
Her touch had not been a comfort. It had been a judgment, a glimpse of a grace he could see but never again possess. The brief, fragile connection was severed, leaving a void more profound than the silence that had preceded it. The car glided to a halt in front of her modest apartment building. The engine idled, a low, rhythmic hum in the deafening silence. The air between them was thick with the wreckage of his confession and the ghost of her touch. Nothing else needed to be said. Everything had been said. He did not look at her as she reached for the door handle. She did not look at him as she stepped out onto the cold, damp pavement. The door closed with a soft, final click, and the black car pulled away, disappearing into the city's endless night. She stood on the curb, motionless, the red of his taillights bleeding into the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that the man who had just left was infinitely more dangerous than the myth, because she had seen his soul. The days that followed were a lesson in the physics of a vacuum. The space Julian Thorne had occupied in her life, first as a silent observer and then as a catastrophic force, was now a void so profound it had its own gravity, pulling all light and sound into it. Eleanor's small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like an echo chamber, replaying the low timbre of his confession, the sharp intake of his breath when she had touched him, the final deafening click of the car door. The loss of her job was a practical problem, a terrifying equation of rent and tuition she could no longer solve. But the silence he left behind was a wound of a different kind. It was the absence of a storm she had only just begun to understand, and she found, to her horror, that she missed the rain. Her attempts to re-enter the world she had known were met with a series of polite, impenetrable walls. She applied for positions at other high-end establishments, places where her experience should have made her an ideal candidate. But a single phone call, a quiet background check, was all it took. The name Eleanor Vance was now inextricably linked with Julian Thorne. She was no longer a discreet, efficient hostess. She was a story, a liability, a woman who had walked out of the Sovereign Club under the personal escort of a man who did not have guests, only assets and enemies. The protection he had given her had become a brand, marking her as untouchable to the very world she desperately needed to survive in, a ghost haunting the edges of polite society. Yet a strange and unsettling peace settled over her daily life. The casual cruelties of the city seemed to part for her. The leering men on the subway, the aggressive catcalls on the street,
The general grinding friction of urban anonymity, it all receded. She felt a shield around her, invisible but absolute. It was his power, operating remotely, a network of unseen eyes and unheard warnings that kept the wolves at bay. This silent, pervasive guardianship was a terrifying comfort. He had removed himself from her life, but had left his shadow in his place, a constant, chilling reminder that she was both abandoned and possessed, free in a cage whose bars she could not see, but could always, always feel. She spent hours replaying his story in her mind, the pieces of his past clicking into place to form a mosaic of grief and brutal resolve. The cold, controlled man in the dark suit dissolved, replaced by the image of a helpless boy watching the purest thing in his world be destroyed. Her fear of him had been simple, a primal response to a predator. But what she felt now was a complex, aching empathy that was far more dangerous. She understood that his empire of darkness was not built on a foundation of greed, but on the bedrock of a single unbearable memory. He ruled a world of monsters to ensure no monster could ever touch what he chose to protect. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he saw his sister's ghost in her eyes. The autumn rain became a constant companion, streaking the glass of her window like tears. She would stand for hours, watching the city lights blur into a watercolor of gold and red, a world of life and connection that felt a million miles away. The window was a barrier, separating her from the rhythm of a life she no longer knew how to live. Each car that passed on the wet street below could have been his, a fleeting shadow in the night. The city was his kingdom, and she was an exile within its walls, looking out from her small, quiet tower. The rain washed the streets clean, but it could not wash away the memory of his presence, or the profound, isolating weight of his absence. The world outside felt vast and threatening, not because of its dangers, but because he was in it, somewhere, breathing the same damp air. Time began to stretch and warp, measured not by the hands of the clock on her wall, but by the growing distance between that night and now. A week felt like a month felt like a lifetime. The initial frantic panic over her finances slowly cooled into a low, constant hum of anxiety. The emotional turmoil, however, only deepened. His silence was an active thing, a deliberate choice he was making every single day. She imagined him in his world of shadows, in boardrooms that were battlefields, and in silent cars moving toward unseen violence.
She saw him deliberately hardening his heart, reinforcing the walls she had, for a moment, breached. The loneliness was no longer just the absence of people, it was the specific, targeted absence of him. One afternoon, while walking through a crowded market, she saw a man across the square with the same posture, the same severe, tailored silhouette. Her heart seized in her chest, a painful, hopeful lurch. For a single, breathless second, she allowed herself to believe it was him, that he had come back, that the silence was broken. She took a step forward, his name a ghost on her lips. But then the man turned, and the face was that of a stranger, his features ordinary and unburdened. The wave of disappointment that crashed over her was so physically powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was in that moment she understood the depth of the mark he had left on her. He was gone, but he was everywhere. The pain, which had been a constant, sharp companion, began a slow transformation. It did not lessen, but it clarified. She started to see his withdrawal not as a rejection, but as the only act of true protection he could offer. To bring her into his world would be to destroy her, to tarnish the very integrity he sought to shield. His disappearance was a sacrifice, a surgical amputation of her from his life to save her from the disease of his existence. He had built a fortress around the memory of his sister, and now he was building one around Eleanor.
And the cruel irony was that the walls had to keep him out too. This painful lucidity was a heavier burden than ignorance, but it was a burden she could carry with a strange, sad dignity. She found a job in a quiet, dusty bookstore in a forgotten corner of the city, a place of paper and ink, of stories that were contained and complete. The work was anonymous, the pay was barely enough to survive, but it was hers. It was a world away from the velvet and crystal of the Sovereign Club, a deliberate retreat into a life of simplicity. She spent her days surrounded by the silent company of authors long dead, their words a balm on her fractured spirit. Here she was not Julian Thorne's project or a whispered story. She was just a woman who recommended books to lonely people. It was a small act of reclamation, a quiet declaration that she would not be defined by the king who had abdicated his claim to her life. Yet even here, in the sanctuary of stories, the silence lingered. It was in the space between the ticking of the old grandfather clock by the door and the soft rustle of a turning page. The connection between them had not been broken. It had simply been muted, stretched thin across the city's expanse like an invisible high-tension wire. It hummed with the energy of everything left unsaid, of a confession met with a touch, of a shared moment of grace in a world that had none. She was safe, she was free, but she knew that a part of her would forever be standing in the rain, waiting for a car that would never arrive. The quiet was no longer an absence of sound. It was the sound of his name unspoken. 2 years passed, a silent expanse measured in the turning pages of old books and the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed. Eleanor stood amidst the bright, clean space of a Soho art gallery, a world of white walls and hopeful ambition. The air hummed with excited chatter and the clinking of glasses, a sound so different from the conspiratorial whispers of her past. This was Leo's night, his first solo exhibition. His paintings, vibrant and raw, pulsed with a life she had fought to protect. A quiet, profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling she had earned not with feigned smiles, but with the dignity of her own 2 hands. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. She was the silent, steady author of this one, and it was, at last, a story of hope. She was admiring a large canvas, a swirl of defiant color against a dark background that felt achingly familiar, when the sensation returned. It was a ghost of a feeling, a weight on the air, a prickle of awareness on the back of her neck that she had not felt since the last time she saw his taillights disappear into the rain. She told herself it was a memory, an echo, triggered by the pressure and the crowd. But it was too specific, too real. It was the feeling of being seen, not just looked at, but truly and completely seen by a gaze that could dismantle a soul. The carefully constructed piece of her new life trembled, threatened by a presence she had relegated to the darkest corners of her memory. He was here. Her heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs as she turned, her eyes scanning the sea of unfamiliar faces. She searched past the art critics in their sharp suits and the wealthy patrons dripping with jewels, looking for a shadow in the bright celebratory light. And then he found him. He stood near the entrance, partially obscured by a marble pillar, a figure of absolute stillness in a room of constant motion. He was exactly as she remembered, a creature of tailored darkness, his presence a void that seemed to absorb the light around it. He was not looking at the art on the walls. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, and intense, only on her, cutting across the crowded room as if no one else existed. The noise of the gallery dissolved into a muted, distant roar.
The space between them became a silent, charged vacuum, filled with 2 years of unspoken words, of absence, of a connection that had refused to die. His expression was unreadable from this distance, yet she could feel its weight, its meaning. It was not the look of a predator assessing his prey, nor was it the possessive gaze of a king. It was something new, something earned. It was a look of profound, quiet respect. He was not just seeing the woman who had survived. He was seeing the woman who had triumphed, who had taken the broken pieces of her life and built a world of light, all on her own. He was bearing witness to her victory. In that single, sustained look, she saw his own story reflected back at her. The haunted guilt was still there, etched into the severe lines of his face, but it was no longer a consuming fire. It had been tempered into a kind of solemn acceptance. He had kept his silent, impossible vow. He had protected her by leaving her, by allowing her the dignity of her own fight. In her strength, he had found a vicarious redemption, a peace his own world could never offer. He raised his glass in a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible, a silent toast across a chasm of memory and circumstance. It was an acknowledgment, an absolution, and a final, quiet farewell. Then, with the same liquid grace she remembered, he turned and melted back into the city's shadows, leaving her standing in the light. The place where he had stood was now just empty space, but the warmth of his gaze lingered, a final, gentle touch on her soul. Eleanor turned back to Leo's painting, her hand rising to her heart. She was free, and he, in his own way, was redeemed. Their worlds would never touch again, but they were forever bound by a single act of courage that had saved them both. His protection had not been a cage, but a key, unlocking a strength she never knew she possessed. Her story was proof that the deepest human connections are not forged in light, but are found in the shared darkness, and that even a whisper of integrity can echo through an empire. If their silent bond moved you, let us know by liking and sharing this story. Tell us in the comments what you believe that final, unspoken promise truly meant.